The air inside the Russell Senate office building felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves could sense a storm brewing. The committee room, with its high ceilings and polished mahogany tables, seemed too small for the tension that hummed in the air. Journalists shuffled in their seats, cameras mounted on tripods already aimed at the witness table. Staffers whispered in low tones, their eyes flicking toward the heavy wooden doors at the far end of the room. Outside, Washington was showing its first real signs of spring. The cherry blossoms had begun to blush against the crisp blue sky, but inside the building, the atmosphere was anything but gentle. The bright white light from overhead fixtures reflected off brass nameplates, lending the room a sterile, almost surgical quality. This was not going to be an ordinary hearing. Alicia Turner stepped through the doorway, her navy blazer perfectly pressed, her bob haircut framing her face with precision. At 33, she carried herself with the kind of poise that made people do a double-take. There was no wasted movement as she walked down the center aisle, heels clicking against the marble floor in steady rhythm. She placed her folder of prepared remarks on the witness table, adjusted her chair, and glanced toward the dais where the senators sat. She could feel his eyes on her before she saw him. Senator Richard Coleman, 65 years old, with a full head of silver hair and a reputation for dismantling opponents in committee hearings, sat 3 seats from the center. He didn't look at her directly at first, just a flick of the eyes, a quick measure of his target, before turning to whisper something to the senator beside him. Alicia caught the faintest smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. 6 months ago, she had made him look unprepared and overconfident in front of the cameras, questioning a witness he had personally brought to testify. That exchange had gone viral in political circles. Coleman had downplayed it afterward, but the flush of his cheeks that day had told Alicia everything she needed to know. He hadn't forgotten, and he certainly hadn't forgiven. Today, they would be on opposite sides of a debate that had been building for months. The American Voting Rights Protection Act. The legislation sought to standardize voting access across states, ensuring polling places, early voting days, and registration processes met certain federal benchmarks. For Alicia, it was about ensuring every eligible voter had a fair shot at the ballot. For Coleman, it was an overreach, a federal intrusion into state-run elections. "Good morning, Ms. Turner," came the even voice of Senator Harold Whitman, the committee chair. His Midwestern accent softened the formalities, but his eyes moved quickly over the room, gauging the mood. "Thank you for joining us today." "Thank you, Senator Whitman," Alicia replied, her voice calm but carrying clearly through the microphone. She folded her hands in front of her, not gripping them tightly, just resting them in a way that projected readiness. Whitman cleared his throat and glanced at the agenda in front of him. "We'll begin with opening remarks from our members, followed by questions to our witness." The murmur in the gallery quieted. Reporters stilled their pens. Alicia noticed a few camera operators lean forward, already sensing that today's hearing might deliver the kind of moments that drive headlines. Across the dais, Coleman adjusted his glasses and shuffled his papers with deliberate slowness, as though savoring the anticipation. As the opening remarks began, Alicia listened politely, though she already knew the arguments she would hear. Coleman's allies spoke of protecting election integrity and respecting state sovereignty. Her supporters emphasized equal access and removing unnecessary barriers. It was all expected. The real show would begin once the floor was open for questions. Whitman's gavel tapped softly against the block. "We'll now proceed to member questions. Senator Coleman, you're recognized." Coleman leaned toward his microphone, his chair creaking slightly. He offered a thin smile in Alicia's direction, the kind that wasn't meant to comfort. "Ms. Turner," he began, his voice warm with a southern lilt that carried more edge than hospitality. "In your vast experience." He let the words trail, as if the phrase itself was an open-ended challenge. A few people in the gallery shifted in their seats. Alicia felt the weight of every camera lens focusing in on her. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. She'd been here before, in courtrooms, in press interviews, in heated negotiations, and she knew better than to meet provocation with anything other than steady patience. Coleman continued, "Tell me, in your vast experience, how exactly do you justify federal interference in state election laws?" The question hung in the air. Alicia knew this was only the opening jab, the first probe to test her footing. She took a slow breath, adjusted her microphone just slightly, and prepared to respond. But before she could, Coleman leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on her, as if daring her to give him the soundbite he wanted. Somewhere in the second row of the gallery, a reporter raised his pen, poised to capture the first volley of what everyone suspected could be the defining exchange of the day. "Turner, in your vast experience," Senator Richard Coleman repeated, the corners of his mouth tightening into something between a smirk and a sneer. The words dripped with condescension, as if he'd been waiting months to deliver them. Alicia Turner met his gaze without blinking. Her hands remained folded on the table, her posture unshaken. "In my experience, Senator," she began evenly, "federal oversight of voting rights isn't interference. It's constitutional protection. The 15th Amendment—" "Oh, please." Coleman's voice cut through the room, sharper now, his southern drawl stretching the syllables into a performance. "Don't lecture me about the Constitution, young lady. I was studying constitutional law when you were in elementary school." A ripple moved through the gallery. Some of the Democratic senators shifted in their chairs, eyes narrowing. Republican staffers sitting behind Coleman exchanged quick glances, part amusement, part anticipation. The air in the room felt suddenly denser, as though everyone sensed the temperature rising. Alicia didn't take the bait. "Senator," she replied calmly, "the Constitution doesn't have an expiration date. The principles are the same whether you studied them in 1985 or I studied them in 2015. The jab was subtle, but Coleman's jaw twitched. "You Democrats," he began, leaning forward now, "come in here with your talking points and your viral video moments, but you don't understand the real-world consequences of what you're proposing." He pushed his chair back abruptly and stood, a full 6 feet of veteran lawmaker looming over the witness table. The movement was deliberate, a display of dominance meant to unsettle her. "These election laws you want to overturn," Coleman continued, gesturing with an open hand toward the committee members, "were passed by democratically elected state legislatures. But I guess democracy only counts when it goes your way, right?" The cameras tightened their focus, Coleman standing, voice pitched high enough to echo in the rafters, Alicia seated, her expression unchanged. She tilted her head slightly, her voice quiet but clear. "Are you accusing me personally, Senator?" Coleman hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for the question to land. "I'm saying you Democrats—" "No, sir," Alicia interrupted smoothly, her tone still calm. "You said you. You pointed at me and said I want to make it easier to cheat. Are you accusing me personally of facilitating election fraud?" The room froze. Even the steady clack of the stenographer's keys stopped for a heartbeat. Coleman's mouth opened, then closed. "I'm saying your policies—" "Senator," Alicia said, her voice carrying a faint steel edge now, "I'm a former prosecutor. I know the difference between discussing policies and making a personal accusation. Which one are you making right now?" For the first time that morning, Coleman faltered. His eyes darted briefly toward the chairman, then back to Alicia, as though he'd lost the rhythm of the exchange. He tried to recover by raising his voice. "You know what? I'm tired of being lectured by people who think being young and loud makes them right. I've been fighting for conservative principles since before you were born." The statement drew a few murmurs from the gallery. Coleman began pacing, his hands slicing through the air as if each gesture could underline his frustration. "You come to Washington thinking you're going to change everything, but you don't know how anything works," he continued. "You're just another social media politician looking for your next viral moment." Behind him, a few Republican senators shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware of how the scene would play on television. Coleman turned back toward Alicia, pointing directly at her. "This is the United States Senate, not some college debate club." Through it all, Alicia remained perfectly still, her eyes tracking his movements like a chess player watching an opponent make a reckless move. Her folded hands never moved. Her breathing stayed even. She leaned forward just enough to reach the microphone. "Are you finished, Senator?" The question landed like a soft thud in a quiet room. Coleman stopped mid-step, still holding his papers in one hand. He gave a curt nod. "Good," Alicia said, allowing just the faintest hint of a smile. "Because now it's my turn." A few reporters in the gallery exchanged knowing glances. They had seen this before, an opponent spending all their energy in the opening round, leaving themselves exposed for the counterattack. From the corner of her eye, Alicia caught sight of one of her aides in the back row. He gave the slightest nod. She knew she was exactly where she wanted to be. The gavel hadn't moved. The cameras were still rolling. The moment was hers to take. The room went silent, as though every person present had realized Senator Richard Coleman had just stepped into dangerous territory. The question Alicia Turner had posed still hovered in the air like a suspended blade. "Are you accusing me personally of facilitating election fraud?" Coleman had nodded for her to continue, but the flicker in his eyes betrayed a crack in his confidence. Alicia adjusted her microphone again, not out of nervousness, but with the precision of someone taking careful aim. "Senator," she began, her voice as even as if she were reading from a prepared statement, "you've made several assertions here today about my intentions, about this legislation, about what you call election integrity. Let's talk about the facts." She opened the slim folder in front of her and pulled out a single page. The paper didn't shake in her hands. "And according to the Heritage Foundation, a conservative organization you've cited before, there were 31 documented cases of voter fraud in the 2020 election. That's 31 cases out of more than 159 million votes cast nationwide. That is a fraud rate of 0.0000019%. A ripple of quiet laughter rolled through the Democratic side of the dais, Coleman's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Meanwhile," Alicia continued, "the voting restrictions you're defending would make it harder for millions of eligible Americans to vote. So I have to ask you, Senator, how is preventing millions of people from voting an appropriate response to preventing 31 cases of fraud?" Coleman opened his mouth, but she lifted a hand, just one finger, a polite but unmistakable request for silence. "No, sir. You had your time. Now it's my turn, and I intend to use it more efficiently than you used yours." The gallery erupted into a few scattered chuckles before falling quiet again. Coleman's jaw worked as though he were chewing over his options, but Alicia didn't give him time to find a comfortable line of attack. "You've been in the Senate for 28 years, she said. "In all that time, can you name one voting rights measure you've supported that would make it easier for eligible Americans to vote?" The silence that followed was not the kind of silence that comes from mutual respect. It was the charged, restless kind, the kind that makes people shift in their seats and lean forward without realizing it. Coleman glanced down at his papers, shuffled them, cleared his throat, looked back up. "I can name several restrictions you've supported," Alicia pressed on, flipping to another page. "The South Carolina voter ID law you championed in 2011, your support for reducing early voting days, your opposition to automatic voter registration, your vote against the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Twice." Coleman's face reddened, but his eyes darted toward the cameras, the instinct of a seasoned politician aware of optics even when cornered. "And since you mentioned the Constitution earlier," Alicia said, leaning forward slightly, "let's talk about the 15th Amendment. It states, and I quote, 'The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude.'" She paused just long enough to let the words settle. "Now, data from your state of South Carolina shows that in counties with higher black populations, voters face significantly longer wait times, fewer polling locations per capita, and stricter ID requirements. How do you reconcile that with the 15th Amendment you claim to uphold?" Coleman inhaled sharply. his chest rising as though ready to launch into another tirade. But he hesitated, because the cameras were on, because the numbers were real, because every eye in the room was on him. Alicia didn't need to raise her voice. The power was already hers. "My generation," she said, "doesn't believe that volume equals validity. We don't believe seniority equals superiority. And we don't believe intimidation equals intelligence. We believe in showing up with facts, in treating people with respect regardless of their age, race, or party affiliation, and in making democracy work for everyone, not just the people you think deserve it." The sound of typing filled the air as reporters tried to keep up. On the far right side of the dais, a younger Republican senator watched with a kind of wary fascination, his pen frozen over his notepad. Coleman's fingers drummed an irregular beat against the wood of the table. He still hadn't answered her question. "Let me repeat it for you, Senator," Alicia said, her tone softer now, almost sympathetic. "In 28 years, can you name one voting rights protection you've supported that expanded access for eligible voters?" This time, the silence was complete. Not even the camera shutters clicked. Coleman's lips parted, but no sound came. His eyes dropped to the desk. The stillness was broken only by the hum of the air conditioning, a low, steady sound that seemed to underline the weight of the moment. And in that moment, Alicia knew the turning point had come. Coleman's jaw tightened as if clenching his teeth might help him find an answer that didn't exist. His fingers began tapping the desk, sharp, uneven beats that betrayed more than he realized. Every camera in the room caught the shift. Alicia Turner stayed perfectly still, letting the silence stretch. It was an old trial lawyer's tactic. When the witness is cornered, don't rush. Let the tension work for you. Finally, Coleman cleared his throat. What I've always stood for is protecting election integrity," he said, the words tumbling out unevenly, "making sure that every legitimate vote counts and making it harder for certain citizens to cast those legitimate votes," Alicia interjected smoothly, not missing a beat. Coleman's head snapped up. "That's not—" She lifted another page from her folder. "Senator, according to the Brennan Center for Justice, your state has closed over 200 polling locations in the last decade, most of them in predominantly black and low-income neighborhoods. Is that your definition of election integrity?" The murmur in the gallery grew louder. Several reporters leaned forward, pens scratching furiously. Coleman's voice rose. "Those decisions are made at the state level, not by me personally." "But you supported them," Alicia said, her tone still calm. "You praised them in a press release on July 8, 2017. I have the copy right here." She held up a printed page, the official Senate letterhead, visible even from several feet away. Coleman's cheeks flushed a deeper shade of red. He glanced toward the committee chair, Senator Harold Whitman, as if seeking an intervention. But Whitman simply adjusted his glasses and said nothing. "This isn't about race," Coleman snapped, turning back to Alicia. "Then explain why the closures disproportionately affect black voters," she countered, sliding another document across the table toward the clerk. "Here's the data from your own state election commission. The numbers aren't partisan, Senator. They're math." Coleman pushed back his chair and stood again, looming over the table. His voice cracked with the strain of trying to project control he no longer had. "You're twisting facts to fit your narrative." Alicia looked up at him without flinching. "I'm reading your state's official reports. Are you suggesting the numbers your own government publishes are false?" The room went still again. Coleman's breathing was audible through the microphone. He shuffled the papers in front of him, but it was clear he wasn't reading them. From somewhere in the back of the gallery, a phone buzzed. A notification from Twitter announcing a trending topic, #Coleman Cornered. Alicia turned another page in her folder. "Let's move on to voter ID laws. In 2011, you sponsored legislation requiring specific forms of identification that disproportionately excluded minorities, the elderly, and students. Can you tell this committee how many cases of voter fraud that law actually prevented?" Coleman hesitated. "I don't have that number in front of me." "I do," Alicia said, sliding a sheet toward the clerk. 5 cases, over 10 years. 5. The gasp from the gallery was almost theatrical. Even some senators on the Republican side shifted uncomfortably. Coleman's voice rose again. "This is about ensuring confidence in our elections. And yet," Alicia said, cutting in, "polling from your own state university shows that voter confidence declined after the law was enacted, particularly among minority communities who felt targeted by the changes. So, if confidence is your goal, Senator, you've failed by your own metric." That landed hard. Coleman gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles whitening. Alicia let the pause breathe for a moment before leaning forward slightly. "You've accused me today of wanting to make it easier to cheat. I've shown you the actual numbers. 31 cases nationwide in 2020, 5 in your state over a decade, millions potentially disenfranchised by the measures you support. So I'll ask again, is this about protecting elections or protecting power?" Coleman's eyes narrowed, but no words came. His jaw worked, his lips pressed together, and his gaze dropped to the desk. The committee room felt like it had tilted. For the first time, Coleman looked smaller, diminished not by Alicia's stature, but by the weight of the evidence pressing down on him. In the gallery, a reporter whispered to his colleague, "She's got him." Senator Whitman finally spoke, his voice measured. "Senator Coleman, do you wish to respond?" Coleman straightened, forcing his voice into something resembling composure. "No further questions." He sat down heavily, the leather of his chair creaking under the shift of his weight. Alicia nodded once, closing her folder with deliberate calm. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman." The gavel didn't fall, but the moment had. The silence in the chamber after Alicia Turner's last question was almost tangible. It hung there, suspended in the warm glow of the overhead lights, pressing down on every person in the room. Even the soft hum of the air conditioning seemed distant, muted by the weight of what had just unfolded. Senator Richard Coleman shifted in his chair, his gaze fixed on some invisible point just above his notes. The sharpness that had carried his voice earlier was gone, replaced by a kind of brittle stillness. Alicia didn't press further. She didn't need to. Every word, every statistic, every pointed question had already done its work. The cameras had caught it all, the senator's rising volume, her calm responses, the moment he'd been left without an answer. Senator Harold Whitman cleared his throat, the sound breaking the tension. "Thank you, Ms. Turner. We appreciate your testimony." "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," Alicia replied, her tone steady, the same one she had carried throughout the hearing. She didn't smile, didn't gloat, just met Whitman's eyes with professional courtesy. As the chair moved on to the next agenda item, whispers spread quietly across the dais. Democratic senators leaned back in their chairs, some exchanging subtle nods in Alicia's direction. On the Republican side, a few looked down at their notes, avoiding eye contact with Coleman. In the gallery, journalists were already typing furiously, their screens filled with half-formed headlines. On Twitter, clips from the hearing were beginning to circulate. One particularly striking still frame, a red-faced Coleman pointing a finger across the table while Alicia sat perfectly composed, was quickly becoming the image of the day. Alicia kept her focus on the proceedings, even as her phone buzzed quietly in her bag with messages from her staff. She knew the reaction outside these walls would be intense, but for now, the only thing that mattered was finishing the hearing with the same composure she had started it. The final questions of the session came from senators who kept their tone measured, perhaps wary of becoming the next viral moment. Alicia answered each one with precision, weaving constitutional principles and data into responses that were both substantive and succinct. When Whitman finally tapped the gavel to adjourn, the room exhaled as one. Staffers began gathering papers, reporters hurried toward the exits to file their stories, and the low rumble of conversation returned. Coleman stood slowly, gathering his papers with a stiffness that suggested the weight of something heavier than documents. He avoided looking in Alicia's direction as he made his way to the side door, his steps brisk, his jaw set. Cameras tracked him until he disappeared from view. Alicia remained seated for a moment, methodically organizing her notes. She knew what the optics would be. The image of her calm and collected at the table, while Coleman retreated from the room. "Ms. Turner," one of the Democratic senators said as he passed by, leaning down slightly. "That was masterful." "Thank you, Senator," she replied simply. Another colleague, a congresswoman who had been watching from the back, gave her a quick pat on the shoulder. "You just set the standard for the rest of us." As Alicia left the room, the flashes from the photographers intensified. She kept her expression neutral, her stride steady. In the hallway, reporters called out questions, but she offered only a polite, "No comment at this time," before stepping into the waiting elevator. Inside the elevator, away from the noise, she allowed herself a single deep breath. Not relief, she had expected this outcome, but acknowledgement. Months of preparation, of studying Coleman's tactics, of anticipating every angle, had paid off. Her phone vibrated again. A quick glance revealed a flood of notifications. Text messages from friends, emails from advocacy groups, mentions on social media climbing by the second. In the corner of the screen, one notification stood out. A trending hashtag, #CalmOverChaos. She knew instantly that the phrase would stick. By the time she stepped out onto Constitution Avenue, the late afternoon sun was spilling gold across the city. The air was crisp, the cherry blossoms along the street swaying gently in the breeze. She pulled her blazer a little tighter against the cool air and began the walk toward her office. She didn't need to check the headlines to know what they would say. The story was already writing itself. By nightfall, Alicia Turner's name was everywhere. Cable news banners scrolled her quotes. Twitter threads dissected her delivery, her posture, even the way she held her pen. Instagram reels replayed the moment she asked Senator Richard Coleman if he was accusing her personally of facilitating election fraud, paired with captions like, "The calm before the checkmate." Inside her Washington, D.C. apartment, the city lights glittered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Alicia sat at her kitchen table, still in her blazer, a mug of chamomile tea cooling beside her laptop. The day had been relentless. Committee hearing, hallway cameras, a short walk to her office trailed by reporters, then a cascade of phone calls and messages. Her staff had sent over a summary of media coverage. The numbers were staggering. #CalmOverChaos had trended at number 2 nationwide. Clips of her exchanges with Coleman had collectively passed 12 million views across platforms in less than 12 hours. Editorial boards from The Washington Post to USA Today had published late-day op-eds praising her composure and preparation. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from a senior member of her party. "You just showed the country how to win without shouting. Call me tomorrow." Alicia set the phone down and glanced at the television across the room. On CNN, Anderson Cooper was mid-segment, replaying the exchange with slow-motion breakdowns from a body language expert. "Notice," the expert said, "how Ms. Turner's shoulders remain relaxed even when Coleman raises his voice. That communicates control, not just to him, but to everyone watching." Switching channels, Alicia caught the tail end of a Fox News discussion. While the panel criticized her policy positions, even the conservative commentator admitted, "Look, I disagree with her politics, but she handled herself better than most seasoned senators do under pressure." Her email inbox was overflowing. There were congratulations from civil rights organizations, invitations to speak at universities, and more interview requests than her staff could possibly schedule. But amid the flood, one message stood out. It was from a retired public defender in Dallas, someone she had interned for years ago. "Proud doesn't even begin to cover it. You stood your ground the same way you did in courtrooms back home." Alicia smiled faintly. That meant more than any trending hashtag. Her chief of staff, Jordan, arrived a little before 8 with takeout containers and a laptop under his arm. "Figured you hadn't eaten," he said, setting the food on the counter. "Also figured you'd want to see this." He spun the laptop around to show a live feed from MSNBC, where Rachel Maddow was opening her show with the words, "Alicia Turner just gave a masterclass in political communication." Jordan dropped into the chair across from her. "Fundraising link we set up this afternoon? Already passed $1 million, and that's just small donor contributions." Alicia leaned back, exhaling slowly. "It's not about the money," she said, though she knew the numbers mattered. What struck her more was the flood of comments Jordan scrolled through, messages from young women, especially women of color, saying they felt seen, represented, and inspired. One read, "My daughter watched the whole hearing. She said, 'Mom, she looks like us. Thank you for showing her what's possible.'" That one she saved to her phone. Later that night, after Jordan left, Alicia stood by the window looking out at the Capitol dome, glowing against the dark sky. The adrenaline from the day had finally begun to ebb, leaving behind a steady hum of purpose. She thought about all the hours of preparation, the decision to remain calm when every instinct told her to push back harder, the knowledge that composure could be its own form of power. Her phone rang again, this time an unlisted number. She hesitated, then answered. "Alicia," came the warm, deliberate voice of a senior party leader. "I just wanted to tell you, you didn't just win that exchange. You raised the bar for all of us. This is the new standard." They spoke for a few minutes about policy, about the road ahead, about opportunities that would now come her way. When the call ended, Alicia set the phone down gently and allowed herself a small, quiet laugh. "This is just the beginning," she murmured to the empty room. Outside, the cherry blossoms swayed in the night breeze, their pale petals catching the streetlights. Somewhere in the distance, the low rumble of late-night traffic hummed through the city. Inside, Alicia Turner stood at the edge of her table, still in her blazer, the day's weight settling into something steadier. Resolve. Tomorrow would bring more cameras, more questions, more scrutiny. But tonight, she had done exactly what she came to Washington to do: stand her ground, defend her principles, and show that true strength doesn't need to shout. The sun had long set over Washington when the echoes of the day began to settle into memory. In that Senate chamber, amid the polished wood and harsh lights, something more lasting than a political exchange had taken place. Alicia Turner's steady voice and unshakable composure had done more than counter a single senator's accusations. She had given the nation a quiet reminder of what dignity under pressure looks like. For many watching, especially those in the Black community, the moment carried an extra weight. It wasn't just about voting rights or legislative debate. It was about seeing someone who had faced the same stereotypes, the same dismissals, stand her ground with facts and grace. Alicia didn't let anger dictate her words. She didn't trade insult for insult. Instead, she let preparation speak, let truth settle where noise could not. Her performance reminded us that strength isn't measured in decibels, but in resolve. Too often in our politics and in life, we mistake volume for conviction. We believe the one who speaks the loudest must have the better argument. But Alicia proved the opposite. When the facts are yours, you don't have to raise your voice to be heard. The lesson resonates far beyond Capitol Hill. In neighborhoods, classrooms, and workplaces, people face moments where they're underestimated, interrupted, or talked over. In those moments, composure can be the most disarming reply. As Alicia showed, you can meet intimidation not with retaliation, but with an unflinching commitment to truth. And in doing so, you not only win the argument, you change the conversation. For the Black community, this moment also underscored something deeper. Representation matters. Seeing someone who looks like you, who shares your history, stand before power and not flinch. It shifts what feels possible. It tells a young girl watching at home that she can walk into any room, no matter who's in it, and own her voice. It tells a young man that he can challenge unfairness with clarity and composure, and that the facts will always be louder than the shout. But this lesson isn't for one group alone. It's for anyone who has ever been dismissed because of their appearance, age, or background. It's a call to prepare, to learn, to be ready when the moment comes, and when it does, to let your calm be your armor and your knowledge be your weapon. In the end, Alicia's victory wasn't just hers. It belonged to every supporter of fair democracy, to every community that values truth over theatrics, and especially to the Black community that saw itself reflected in her courage. Her quiet strength left an image that will linger, a young woman, seated, composed, letting the weight of her words do the work. So take a moment to think about your own battles, the times when standing still was the bravest thing you could do. And if this story has touched you, share it. Pass on its warmth, because sometimes the calmest voices are the ones that echo the longest.